Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858, in a four-story brownstone house on East 20th Street in Manhattan, into a world of privilege and persistent physical suffering. He was a small, pale, desperately sickly child whose body seemed determined to defeat him before he could amount to anything at all. His asthma was severe enough that on bad nights he could not lie flat in bed without the sensation of drowning. He would spend those nights propped up in chairs or being driven through the dark streets of Manhattan in an open carriage, because the cold moving air was one of the few things that gave his lungs any relief. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was by all accounts one of the finest human beings his son would ever know. Warm, generous, endlessly engaged, the sort of man whose presence in a room immediately made everyone in it feel more seen. On the nights when young Teedy, as the family called him, was worst with his asthma, his father would carry him through the house in his arms for hours, his sheer physical warmth and steadiness, sometimes the only thing that quieted the child's laboring lungs. Roosevelt would write about his father with a reverence so complete that it reads less like a son describing a parent and more like a man describing his North Star. What the boy had in lieu of physical health was a mind of ferocious energy and an appetite for the natural world that was almost pathological in its intensity. By the age of 7, he was already keeping a natural history journal, writing down the species of every bird, insect, and mammal he observed, sketching their forms with a child's enthusiasm and a scientist's attention to detail. He called this enterprise the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, and he ran it with absolute seriousness from a corner of the family's uptown house. Specimens were collected, labeled, and arranged. Other children in the neighborhood were recruited as junior curators. The project was completely, beautifully, utterly real to him. The turning point of his boyhood came when his father sat him down and told him plainly that he had a mind, but not a body, and that he would have to make the body. It was not said unkindly. It was said with love and with the confidence that the boy could do it. And the boy, who had worshipped his father completely, decided then and there that he would. He began with a pair of dumbbells in an upstairs piazza and a rowing machine in the family barn. He spent years building himself muscle by muscle, lung capacity by lung capacity, inch by inch against the body that had been trying to stop him since birth. By the time he was a young man, he was not merely healthy. He was a phenomenon, vigorous, with an intensity that alarmed people who met him for the first time, because it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ordinary physical fitness. Roosevelt arrived at Harvard in 1876 at the age of 17 with his natural history notebooks, his taxidermy kit, and an energy level that his classmates found simultaneously inspiring and exhausting. He was not a typical Harvard man. He was too enthusiastic, too loud, too genuinely interested in too many things at once. He had opinions about everything and delivered them at considerable volume. He boxed in the college gymnasium with an intensity that unnerved his sparring partners. He danced at society events with the same total commitment he brought to everything, which made him an alarming dance partner for young women accustomed to more measured partners. He was also reading everything, not just his coursework, everything. Natural history, German philosophy, naval history, poetry, biography, theology, political science. He read the way other people breathe, continuously and without apparent effort, absorbing books at a rate that baffled his professors and delighted him endlessly. He would later say that a day without reading felt to him physically incomplete, like a day without food. In his busiest years in Washington, when the demands of the presidency consumed every waking hour, he still managed at least one book a day, sometimes reading in the brief intervals between meetings, sometimes finishing a volume after midnight when the house was quiet. And then, in the winter of his junior year, he met Alice Lee. She was 17, blonde, laughing, and possessed of a beauty and a vitality that stopped Roosevelt completely in his tracks, which was no small thing, because Roosevelt was not the kind of person who stopped for anything. He fell in love with the completeness and the seriousness that he brought to everything else, and he pursued her with a determination that would have worn down anyone else long before it wore down Alice. She made him wait. She was not certain. He persisted with letters and visits, and a conviction so total that it was almost impossible to resist. On January 25, 1880, she finally said yes, and Roosevelt was so overwhelmed with happiness that he ran 3 miles and climbed a tree. They married that autumn, when he was 22 and she was 19, and the 3 years that followed were the closest thing to uncomplicated happiness that Roosevelt's life would ever contain. He was at Columbia Law School, then elected to the New York State Assembly, already beginning the political career that would eventually carry him to Washington. But in the evenings, he came home to Alice, and those evenings were, by everything he ever wrote about them, enough. February 14th, 1884. Valentine's Day. Theodore Roosevelt was in Albany when the telegrams arrived. His wife Alice had given birth to their first child, a daughter, but something was wrong with Alice, something the doctors could not immediately explain. And his mother was ill too, suddenly, alarmingly ill. He took the first train back to Manhattan, arriving late that night at the family brownstone on West 57th Street. What he found there was beyond any preparation. His mother, Mitty, was dying of typhoid fever, burning with a heat that her children could feel from across the room. And upstairs, Alice, who had been fine, who had been healthy, who was supposed to simply be recovering from the birth of their daughter, was dying too. Bright's disease, an acute kidney failure that had developed so suddenly that no one had suspected it until it was too late. Roosevelt held his mother as she died in the early hours of the morning, and then he went upstairs and held his wife as she died in his arms less than 12 hours later on the same day, in the same house. His diary entry for that day is one of the most devastating things in American presidential literature. He drew a large X on the page. Beneath it, he wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." That was all. He could not write more. He had no more words for it. He handed his newborn daughter to his sister Bamie to raise. He could not look at the baby. She had the same eyes as Alice, and he was not yet able to bear it. He threw himself into the legislative session with a ferocity that alarmed his colleagues, working 18-hour days, speaking on the floor of the assembly, with a controlled fury that left people wondering if he was entirely well. He was not entirely well, but work was the only thing he could find that was louder than the grief. That summer, Roosevelt went west. He had been to the Dakota Territory the previous year on a hunting trip, and had fallen in love with the landscape's vast, indifferent grandeur. The way the sky there was simply bigger than anywhere else. the way the silence was a physical presence rather than an absence of sound. He bought a cattle ranch on the Little Missouri River. Then he bought another one. He threw himself into the life of a working rancher with the same furious completeness with which he did everything. And the men who worked with him, cowboys who had expected a soft-handed New York politician and instead found someone who outworked them at nearly everything, came to respect him with a depth that surprised all of them, including Roosevelt himself. He rounded up cattle in temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. He broke horses. He rode the range for days without sleeping in a bed. He grew a beard and a tan, and his glasses were the only thing about him that looked as if they might have originated east of the Mississippi. One of the most famous stories of his Dakota years involves a boat theft. 3 men stole a flat-bottomed boat from his ranch one winter and disappeared downriver in a blizzard. Roosevelt, rather than simply letting them go, spent 3 days building a replacement boat by hand in sub-zero temperatures and then pursued the thieves downriver with 2 ranch hands, caught them after several days, and then, rather than shooting them or leaving them in the snow, marched them for days overland to the nearest sheriff. He read Tolstoy the entire time while keeping his rifle trained on the men with one hand. The Badlands gave him back his body in a way that even his Harvard gymnasium had not quite managed. They gave him back something else, too, a sense that the earth was real, that physical existence was not just a platform for intellectual life, but a gift with its own profound demands. The mountains and rivers and silences of Dakota became a permanent part of his interior landscape, a place he could return to in memory whenever the machinery of public life grew too loud. He would spend the rest of his life fighting to preserve wild places, not just from an intellectual conviction that they should be preserved, but from the deep personal knowledge of what they could do to a broken person. He stayed in Dakota for 2 years, off and on. He wrote 3 books during this period: a biography of Thomas Hart Benton, a biography of Gouverneur Morris, and a history of the Western frontier. He wrote them by lamplight, after full days of physical labor, sitting at a rough wooden table in a log cabin while the Dakota wind pressed against the walls. He was 25 and 26 years old during these years, and by the time he came back east, he was something new. He was not finished grieving Alice. He would carry that grief in some form for the rest of his life, but he had found a way to carry it. He married Edith Carow in London in December 1886, in a quiet ceremony in a fog so thick that the guests could barely see one another across the church. Edith had known Roosevelt since childhood. They had grown up in the same social circles, had been close as young people before Alice. And she understood him with a completeness that was partly the result of having watched him for years, and partly the result of being, in her own way, just as formidable a person as he was. She was quieter than Roosevelt, which would have been difficult to avoid. She was also more disciplined, more precise, less likely to say the first thing that arrived in her head at full volume. She was, in many ways, his ballast. Together they built Sagamore Hill on a bluff above Oyster Bay on Long Island's North Shore, and this house became the truest expression of the Roosevelt who existed outside of public view. It was enormous, but not grand in a formal sense, more like a Victorian library that had somehow grown rooms filled to capacity with books and animal heads and bird nests and children's toys, and the accumulated souvenirs of a life lived at a pace that left traces everywhere it passed. There were 6 children eventually: Alice from his first marriage, then Teddy, Kermit, Ethel, Archibald and Quentin with Edith. And Sagamore Hill, in its fullest years, was a house so alive with activity that visitors often left feeling slightly overwhelmed and entirely charmed. Roosevelt's mornings at Sagamore Hill began before anyone else was awake. He rose with the birds, literally with the birds, because the birds on the Oyster Bay property were one of his abiding obsessions, and he tracked their arrival and departure through the seasons with the meticulous care of a professional ornithologist. He kept lists. He noted the exact date each spring when he first heard the wood thrush or the veery or the ovenbird. He could identify any North American bird by its song alone, in the dark, from a considerable distance, and he did so constantly, pausing mid-sentence in conversations to identify a call from a nearby tree, and then picking up exactly where he had left off, as if nothing had happened, which to him it hadn't. It was simply part of paying attention to the world. After his birds and his breakfast, Roosevelt read. He had a particular chair in his library, a large leather chair worn smooth in the shape of him, and in this chair he could disappear into a book so completely that children had learned not to approach him during these sessions unless they were prepared to wait some time for a response. He read everything: Greek and Roman history, poetry, natural history, naval history, medieval chronicles, French novels, military biography, political philosophy. He read in French and German as easily as in English. He read fiction and non-fiction with equal appetite, refusing the hierarchy that placed one above the other. The sheer scale of Roosevelt's reading is one of the most remarkable facts about any American president. He kept careful records, lists of books read, notes on arguments he had agreed with or disputed, comparisons between authors that read like the informal papers of a working literary scholar. By conservative estimates, he read somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 books in his lifetime. On the mornings after particularly good novels, he was known to appear at the breakfast table visibly moved, unable to discuss anything else until he had talked through what he had just experienced, which could make breakfast at Sagamore Hill on certain mornings feel less like a meal and more like a very enthusiastic graduate seminar. He had strong opinions about literature that he was entirely happy to share with anyone who asked, and many people who did not. He thought Tolstoy was one of the greatest writers who had ever lived, and he read War and Peace multiple times over his life, finding something new in it each time. He admired Dickens deeply, but thought Thackeray was the finer craftsman. He loved Longfellow and Tennyson, and could recite long passages of both from memory, which he did at dinner tables and on campaign trails, and once, famously, while pursuing cattle thieves across the Dakota winter. He was devoted to the King James Bible not just as a religious text, but as a literary achievement. And he believed that any educated person who had not read it thoroughly was operating with a fundamental gap in their understanding of the English language. Poetry was perhaps his deepest private pleasure. He could recite hundreds of poems from memory: Shakespeare, Keats, Shelley, Browning, the Scottish ballads he loved particularly. And he did so not as a performance but as a private act, murmuring lines to himself while walking the grounds of Sagamore Hill or on horseback in the Dakota Hills. Friends who travelled with him on expeditions would sometimes hear him reciting in the dark, quietly, as if working through a problem by running the words through his head. When his son Kermit was at school, Roosevelt's letters to him contained poetry recommendations that fill pages, specific poems, specific passages, explanations of why a particular line was doing something technically unusual that Kermit should notice. His approach to reading was unusual in one specific way that distinguished him from most people who read a great deal. He remembered almost everything. Not just the argument of a book, but its specific texture, the turns of phrase, the particular examples the author used, the moments where the logic was weak, the moments where it was beautiful. He could quote from books he had read 20 years earlier with an accuracy that startled people who knew how many books he was reading at any given time. His secretaries reported that he could dictate a letter that included a quotation from Montaigne and a reference to a medieval Scottish ballad and a citation of a naval engagement from the War of 1812 and a line of Keats, and manage all of this without pausing or consulting a note, because it was all simply there in the vast, organized library of his memory, available at a moment's notice, like books on well-labeled shelves. He wrote as compulsively as he read. His total published output runs to 35 books and thousands of articles, essays, and reviews produced in the margins of one of the most demanding political careers in American history. He dictated some of it, but large portions he wrote by hand at whatever surface was available: the desks of the White House, the rough tables of hunting camps, the writing cases of ocean liners, the notebooks he carried everywhere. He was not a precious writer who needed silence and solitude. He was a writer who simply used every available minute, because for Roosevelt there was no other way to be. What his children remembered most about their father, in the memoirs and letters they left behind, was not the presidency or the public achievements. What they remembered was his physical presence, the sheer force of his engagement with them, the way he played with a completeness of attention that made each child feel, in those moments, like the most important person in his world. He organized what the family called scrambles at Sagamore Hill, obstacle courses through the property that involved climbing trees, scrambling through thickets, crossing the cold waters of the bay, and generally doing whatever the terrain demanded without complaint or detour. The rule was that if a scramble took you up to an obstacle, you had to go over it or through it, never around it. This rule applied to Roosevelt himself equally. He was in his 40s during the Sagamore Hill years of his presidency, and he scrambled right alongside his children without modification, emerging from the bay soaking wet and scratched from the brambles, and completely delighted with himself and everyone around him. He wrote to his children constantly when the presidency kept him in Washington and them at Sagamore Hill. These letters are among the most charming presidential documents in American history, full of small drawings in the margins, invented stories about the White House animals, detailed observations about squirrels and birds on the White House grounds, updates on the family guinea pigs, and the kind of attentive, specific love that takes the time to ask about a particular tree in the yard or a particular friend at school. He signed them, "Your loving father," and meant every word with a precision that his public speeches, carefully constructed for maximum rhetorical effect, could not quite achieve. He brought animals into the family home with an enthusiasm that tested even Edith's considerable patience. The White House during the Roosevelt years housed not just the customary dogs, but a small bear named Jonathan Edwards, a rat named Jonathan, a one-legged rooster, a lizard, a barn owl, guinea pigs whose names Roosevelt knew individually, a badger named Josiah, who was Archie's particular companion, and a pony named Algonquin, who was once smuggled into the White House elevator by Roosevelt's sons to visit Archie when the boy was sick in bed upstairs. Edith drew the line at very little. This was, perhaps, one of the private qualities of the marriage that made it work, as well as it did. Roosevelt's love of the natural world was not the casual appreciation of a country gentleman who enjoyed a pleasant landscape. It was the deep, technical, consuming passion of a man who had been a genuine naturalist since childhood, and who never stopped being one. He corresponded regularly with the leading ornithologists, mammalogists, and naturalists of his era, not as a president paying courtesy attention to scientists, but as an equal, a peer, someone who had read the same papers and had his own observations to contribute. He could identify more than 900 species of North American birds by sight or sound. This was not a party trick. It was the accumulated result of decades of deliberate, meticulous observation, carried out in every landscape he ever moved through. He kept bird lists from every expedition, every holiday, every presidential trip. When he was at Sagamore Hill, he went out before dawn in the spring to listen to the dawn chorus and identify every voice in it, which is the kind of practice that serious birders still regard as one of the more demanding exercises in the discipline. He did it for pleasure. He did it the way some people garden or paint, as a form of contact with something real that the rest of life was sometimes too noisy to permit. His scientific observations were genuine contributions to the record, not gentleman amateur dabbling. The Smithsonian Institution held him in high regard as a field naturalist, and when he organized the Great African Expedition of 1909, embarked on immediately after leaving the presidency, partly to give his successor William Howard Taft room to govern without his predecessor's enormous shadow looming over Washington. The Smithsonian sent a team of scientists with him and treated him as a full collaborator. The expedition collected 11,000 specimens over 11 months, all of which went to the National Museum. Roosevelt's field notes from the expedition are careful, precise, and thorough in the way that only a man who has been keeping field notes since he was 7 years old can manage. He had a particular feeling for birds that went beyond the scientific. He wrote about them with a lyrical attention that surprised people who knew him primarily as a political figure. He thought the wood thrush's song was one of the most beautiful sounds in the world, and he said so in print, with the specificity of a man who has listened to it thousands of times in every hour of the day and every season it appears. He fought for the conservation of bird populations at a time when commercial hunting was devastating species across the continent, establishing federal bird reservations with executive orders that were the first significant legal protections for North American bird populations. He did this not from abstract policy conviction, but because he knew the birds individually, had listened to them for 40 years, and could not stand the thought of a world without them. Roosevelt never forgot that he had built his body himself against its own wishes, and he maintained it with a seriousness that most men half his age found daunting. He boxed throughout his adult life, not as exercise in the modern gym class sense, but as a genuine sport with skilled opponents who were not inclined to take it easy on him. He had been a reasonably capable boxer since his Harvard days, and he continued to spar regularly through the governorship of New York and well into his years in the White House. It was in the White House that the boxing finally cost him. In 1904, he was sparring with a military aide when a blow caught Roosevelt on the side of his head, with enough force to permanently damage the blood vessels in his left eye. He said nothing about it for weeks. Then gradually he noticed that the vision in that eye was fading. By the time he allowed a doctor to examine it, the damage was irreversible. He was effectively blind in his left eye for the rest of his life, a fact he concealed from the public almost completely and mentioned in private only rarely, typically in contexts where it was functionally relevant, such as hunting. He then switched to judo, studying under Japanese instructors with the same methodical seriousness he brought to everything physical. He earned his brown belt, which is not a casual achievement for a man doing it in middle age between presidential appointments. He also wrestled, practiced the broadsword in the White House basement with a former fencing master, and swam in the Potomac in all weather, a habit he maintained from his Albany days, when his neighbors would watch the governor of New York splash cheerfully through water that was considered too cold for swimming by any rational measure. There is a story, well attested by multiple witnesses, that captures the Roosevelt approach to physical life better than any formal account. While he was president, he and a French ambassador named Jules Jusserand were walking together in Rock Creek Park when they reached the Potomac, at a point where the bank was steep and the water cold. Roosevelt stripped off his clothes, plunged in and swam across, expecting Jusserand to follow. The ambassador, after a moment of diplomatic hesitation, stripped down to his gloves, which he kept on, he explained afterward, in case they met ladies on the far bank, and followed. Roosevelt reportedly found this the funniest thing he had encountered in months and retold the story for years, always with the gloves as the punchline, always with the affection of a man who respected another man for getting in the water, even when it was cold. The daily walks of his presidency were famous enough that Washington society organized itself partly around them. Roosevelt walked at a pace that left most companions slightly breathless, and he walked cross-country rather than along established paths, which meant that whatever was in his way, a fence, a stream, a patch of thick brush, was something he went through rather than around, in the same spirit as the Sagamore Hill scrambles. Foreign dignitaries were sometimes taken on these walks as a diplomatic experience that they had not entirely anticipated, emerging from the Rock Creek Park brambles, disheveled and slightly stunned, and thereafter possessed of a very specific understanding of what they were dealing with in this particular American president. Roosevelt collected friends the way he collected books and bird species, with genuine appetite and with no regard for category. His circle included cowboys and kings, naturalists and novelists, painters and prize fighters, journalists and justices of the Supreme Court. He wrote to all of them with the same directness and the same warmth, and he expected and received the same in return. Friendship for Roosevelt was not a social performance or a political tool. It was a genuine human necessity, something he needed the way he needed books and birds and open air, which is to say, urgently and continuously. His friendship with the naturalist John Burroughs, whom he called John, was one of the deepest of his adult life. Burroughs was 20 years older than Roosevelt, a gentle, bearded philosopher of the natural world who'd been writing about birds and seasons and the quiet drama of the American countryside since before Roosevelt was born. They had first met when Roosevelt was already governor of New York, and they had recognized each other immediately in the way that people with the same essential orientation toward the world sometimes do. Two people for whom the Cardinal's song on a January morning was a significant event, for whom the appearance of the first spring wildflower was worth noting in a journal and discussing at length. They went to Yellowstone together in 1903, just the two of them and a small group of guides camping in the park while the naturalist and the president argued companionably about bird identification and geological formations and the proper ratio of observation to interpretation in nature writing. His friendship with Henry Cabot Lodge was something different, a political friendship that became a genuine emotional bond over 30 years. Lodge was cooler, more precise, more conventionally aristocratic than Roosevelt, and their temperamental differences were real. But they wrote to each other with a frankness that neither man showed very often, discussing self-doubt and family worry, and the difficulty of particular decisions in language that their public personas would never have permitted. When Alice died in 1884, Lodge was one of the people who understood what had been lost, and he never forgot it. And Roosevelt never forgot that Lodge had understood. Roosevelt also maintained an unlikely and genuinely warm friendship with John Muir, the great wilderness prophet who was in almost every practical respect the opposite of Roosevelt. Quieter, more solitary, less interested in systems and institutions, more comfortable talking to trees than to senators. Their 3-day camping trip together in Yosemite in 1903, without aides or press or any of the apparatus of a presidential visit, just the two of them and the valley and the falling snow, is one of the finest things either man ever did. Muir talked about glaciers, and Roosevelt listened with complete attention. And somewhere in those 3 days, under the sequoias, something shifted in Roosevelt's already strong conservation instinct and became the policy that would protect more American land than any president before or since. It is one of the clearest examples in American political history of what happens when the right person gets the ear of the right decision-maker at the right moment. He was friends with Edith Wharton and Henry James and Rudyard Kipling and Owen Wister, whose novel The Virginian, dedicated to Roosevelt, was partly inspired by the stories Roosevelt told about his Dakota years. He corresponded with scientists on 3 continents about specific problems in evolutionary biology, bird migration, and North American mammal taxonomy. He maintained warm friendships with the cowboys who had worked with him in the Badlands, writing to them for decades after he had left, asking after their families and their horses and the condition of the land. He never forgot the people who had taken him in when he arrived broken and grieving in the Dakota Territory and helped, without quite meaning to, put him back together. There is something that everyone who spent time with Roosevelt at Sagamore Hill eventually noticed, and it is the thing you would least expect from a man famous for never stopping. He was capable of extraordinary stillness. Not the stillness of someone suppressing energy. He had no gift for suppression, but the stillness of someone who has found the thing that requires his complete and undivided attention and has simply stopped everything else in order to give it. The stillness of the bird watcher in the hour before dawn. The stillness of the reader in the leather chair. the stillness of a man standing at the edge of a Badlands canyon watching the light change on the rock faces opposite, not thinking about anything, just watching. Music moved him in ways he found difficult to articulate, which was unusual for a man who could articulate almost everything. He loved opera, attending performances in New York and Washington with the focused pleasure of a genuine enthusiast rather than a duty-bound supporter of the arts. He loved the Scottish ballads in particular, those old, mournful, beautiful songs that his mother had sung to him as a child in the brownstone on 20th Street. And he could hear them in full performances years later and feel something tighten in his chest that was simultaneously grief and gratitude and the specific quality of childhood that only certain music can retrieve. He was not a musician himself. He had been given piano lessons as a boy and had shown no particular aptitude, which was one of the very few areas of endeavor in his life where effort did not eventually produce mastery. What he had, instead of musical talent, was musical attention, the capacity to listen to a piece of music or a bird's song with the same quality of presence he brought to a book or a conversation, taking it in completely, letting it do what it was doing to him without resistance. This capacity for full reception was perhaps his most underappreciated quality. He is remembered for his output, the books, the speeches, the decisions, the energy expended in every direction simultaneously. But behind all of that output was an equally extraordinary capacity for input, for taking the world in, for being genuinely and deeply affected by it, rather than simply processing it as material for his own productions. The mornings at Sagamore Hill in the years after the presidency had a particular quality that his family remembered differently from the White House years. He was quieter in those mornings, more inclined to sit in the library with a book rather than immediately generating activity, more willing to let a morning unfold at its own pace before he picked up his notebooks and his correspondence and returned to the work that never entirely left him. He would sit with his coffee and watch the light on the bay through the library windows, and on the good mornings, when his health was adequate and the weather was pleasant, and the losses of the previous years were sitting at a manageable distance rather than pressing close, he could stay in that chair for an hour in something close to contentment. Edith knew not to interrupt these mornings unless the interruption was necessary. She had learned in 30 years of marriage the precise calibrations of his inner weather. When the stillness was the productive kind, and when it was the kind that needed company, when he wanted to talk through what he was reading, and when he needed the silence to think in, when the letter writing was going well, and when he needed to be coaxed away from something that was not resolving itself. She managed all of this with the same understated competence she brought to everything, and he was aware of it and grateful for it, and said so in the letters in language that was simpler and more direct than his public prose, because some things did not require rhetoric. He was at his most himself, the people closest to him agreed, in the evenings at Sagamore Hill in the summer, when the long light came through the trees at a low angle and the bay went golden and the children drifted in from whatever they had been doing, and the house slowly filled back up with the noise of a family coming together for the end of the day. In these evenings, he was not the president or the rough rider or the author or the naturalist or any of the other versions of himself that the world had assembled from the available evidence. He was simply a man who had made a family and a home and a library full of books and a property full of birds, and who was sitting on his porch in the evening light, watching everything he loved most in the world gather around him for dinner. The books Roosevelt published during his lifetime range so widely across subject matter that they read like the output of several different people rather than one. The Naval War of 1812, published when he was 23 and still a senior at Harvard, was a serious work of military history that remained a standard reference for decades. The Winning of the West, his 4-volume history of the American frontier, was a decade's work of research and narrative synthesis. His autobiography, written in 1913 in the aftermath of the failed third-party campaign, is one of the most revealing presidential memoirs in the literature. African Game Trails and Through the Brazilian Wilderness are among the finest expedition accounts written in the English language, clear-eyed and scientifically precise, and full of a wonder that never tips into sentimentality. He wrote all of it in the hours that other people used for rest, in the margins of political careers and military service and family life, and the ordinary ongoing demands of a life lived at maximum engagement. He wrote at a speed that suggested he was not composing so much as transcribing something that was already fully formed in his mind. He could produce a coherent, polished essay in the time it takes most writers to settle on a first paragraph. This was not carelessness. His prose is careful, specific, rhythmically varied, and attentive to the needs of the argument at each stage. It was simply that the thinking had happened somewhere else, in the walks and the reading, and the long, solitary hours in the Badlands, and the writing was the moment of release rather than the moment of discovery. His essay on the books he chose to bring with him on the African expedition, packed in a special oilskin case to protect them from the rain, is a minor masterpiece of literary criticism disguised as a packing list. He chose Shakespeare and Tennyson and the King James Bible and Keats and Shelley and Bacon's essays and Euripides and several volumes of American history and Huckleberry Finn, which he considered one of the great American books and reread regularly throughout his life. The essay explaining each choice is affectionate and precise and tells you more about what Roosevelt actually thought about literature than a dozen more formal critical pieces would have managed. There is a particular quality to the thoughts of a man who reads as much as Roosevelt read, who has fed his mind for decades on history and poetry and philosophy and science, a quality of connectedness, of everything linking to everything else through the accumulated associations of a lifetime of attention. Roosevelt's mind, as revealed in the letters and essays and the more private passages of his autobiography, was like a library in which the books had all been read and annotated and cross-referenced, so that a thought about a Roman general could lead naturally to a thought about the Badlands winter, and then to a passage in Tennyson, and then to a memory of his father carrying him through the night when he could not breathe. And all of these things illuminated each other in ways that no single one of them could have managed alone. He was not, by nature, a brooding man. His temperament ran strongly toward engagement rather than withdrawal, toward the world rather than away from it. But the private journals and letters reveal a person who did his serious thinking in the small hours, in the period between when the house was finally quiet and when the dawn birds began. He seems to have needed this time, not for sleep necessarily, but for the kind of uninterrupted interior processing that the relentless sociability of his waking hours did not permit. The letters he wrote late at night have a different quality from his daytime correspondence. more reflective, more willing to linger with uncertainty, more likely to circle a difficult question without landing on an answer. He thought often about mortality, not with morbidity, but with the same clear-eyed curiosity he brought to everything else. He had lost his mother and his wife on the same day when he was 25. He had carried a bullet in his chest from Milwaukee for the last years of his life. He had nearly died on the River of Doubt at 55. He had sent his sons to the war that killed Quentin. He was not unfamiliar with the fact that life was finite, and that the finite quality was not a mistake but a condition, one that made the bird songs and the books and the friends and the mornings at Sagamore Hill not painful in their transience, but more vivid, more worth the full attention he tried always to give them. He wrote in one of his later letters, written to a friend in the final year of his life after Quentin's death and while his own health was beginning its final decline, that he had no complaints about the life he had been given, that it had been a life so full of every kind of experience that he could not, looking back at it, identify a significant absence. He had loved and been loved. He had read tens of thousands of books and written 35 of them. He had seen the sun rise over the African savanna and the snow fall in the Dakota hills and the geysers of Yellowstone and the wild white water of the River of Doubt. He had heard the wood thrush sing every spring for 50 years at Sagamore Hill. What more, he asked, could any honest man require? There is a particular kind of sorrow that belongs to parents who outlive their children, and Roosevelt knew it twice. The first time was with Alice, whose death in 1884 took the light out of his life in the way he wrote about. The second time was in the summer of 1918, when his youngest son, Quentin, 20 years old, a pilot in the First World War that Roosevelt had publicly championed with every ounce of his influence, was shot down over France and killed. Quentin had been, by all accounts, the most like his father of the Roosevelt children, funny, fearless, intensely alive, the one who had smuggled the pony into the White House elevator, who had organized a secret club in the White House attic, who had written his father the kinds of letters that Roosevelt treasured above almost anything else in the world. When the news came to Sagamore Hill on a summer afternoon in 1918, Roosevelt received it in the library, in his chair. He read the telegram. He sat for a long time without speaking. Then he went back to work, because there was nothing else to do, and he had never found another answer to grief, except to keep moving. Those who knew him in the months after Quentin's death said that something had changed permanently, that the extraordinary vitality which had seemed almost supernatural in a man his age had dimmed in some way that was not quite illness, and not quite age, but something in between, a diminishment of the flame. He kept writing, finished a series of articles, worked on his autobiography revisions, wrote letters, always letters. But the people close to him could see that Quentin's death had taken something that the Badlands and the years and all the other griefs had not been able to take. He was 60 years old, and he had been running hard since he was 7, and now he was tired in a way he had not been before. He died on January 6, 1919, in his sleep at Sagamore Hill, in his own bed. His son Archie sent a telegram to his brothers. "The old lion is dead." It was the right phrase. He had been the old lion, not the young one charging up the hill, but the older one, quieter, still magnificent, carrying his accumulated injuries and losses with a dignity that required more courage than the charging had. His doctor said that a blood clot had travelled to his heart during the night, and that he had likely felt nothing, that the transition from sleeping to not sleeping had been that quiet. It seemed right, somehow, that he who had watched the dawn chorus every spring for 60 years should go in the dark hours before the birds began. After the presidency, after the African expedition, after the failed third-party campaign of 1912 that broke the Republican Party and gave the election to Woodrow Wilson and left Roosevelt genuinely devastated in a way he had not expected, after all of that, in 1913, he went to South America. He was 55 years old. He had been shot during the campaign by a would-be assassin in Milwaukee. The bullet lodged in his chest, where it remained for the rest of his life, slowed by his steel glasses case and the thick folded manuscript of the speech he had been about to deliver, and he had delivered the speech anyway, all 90 minutes of it, with the blood soaking his shirt. And he was tired in ways he did not often admit, but was beginning to acknowledge. The journey he undertook in the Amazon basin was not a comfortable expedition. He and his companion, Cândido Rondon, a brilliant Brazilian explorer who would become one of the people Roosevelt most admired in his life, decided to map an unmapped river in the Brazilian interior, a waterway known to the indigenous people of the region and to almost no one else, which the expedition renamed the River of Doubt. This was not a publicity stunt. This was genuine exploration into genuinely unknown territory, and it nearly killed him. The river descended through rapids and falls that required the expedition to repeatedly portage their boats overland through jungle so dense that the sun disappeared entirely for days at a time. Men were lost. Supplies ran critically low. Roosevelt himself developed a tropical fever that put him in a state of delirium for days, during which he repeatedly recited Coleridge's Kubla Khan to himself, the poem surfacing from memory in his fevered hours, the way deep things do when the mind is stripped of its defenses. He grew so ill that he told Rondon to leave him behind, that he was slowing the expedition down, and that the others should go on without him. Rondon refused. They carried him when he could not walk. He survived. He came back to New York in the spring of 1914, 50 pounds lighter, permanently damaged in ways that contributed to the illnesses of his final years, and he immediately sat down and wrote the book about it. Through the Brazilian Wilderness, which is one of the finest pieces of exploration writing in American literature. He wrote it the way he did everything, fully, specifically, gratefully, with the attention of a man who has looked at a thing so closely that he can describe it from the inside. The river they mapped still carries the name they gave it, now the Roosevelt River, running through the Brazilian jungle between its banks of ancient forest, still going. Roosevelt ate with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else, which made him either a wonderful dinner companion or an alarming one, depending on your patience for a person who might, at any moment, stop mid-fork to identify a bird, call coming through the dining room window, and then return to the topic under discussion without breaking the conversational thread. He was not a gourmand in the refined sense. He ate quickly and without great discrimination among flavors, but he ate enormously, which was perhaps the natural consequence of a metabolism burning at the rate his did. His daily physical output was so staggering that merely listing it feels slightly absurd. Boxing in the morning, judo lessons, sword practice in the White House basement, a 2-hour walk at pace that left aides faintly wheezing, swimming in cold water, riding when possible. And underneath all of it, the simple animal fact of a body that had been built against resistance, that knew what it was capable of because it had spent a lifetime testing those limits and finding them further than anyone had expected. He took stairs 2 at a time until he was well into his 50s. He could not sit still in a chair for more than 20 minutes without beginning to fidget. His secretaries learned to follow him as he paced when he dictated, because asking him to stand still while he was thinking was simply not something that could be done. Dinner at Sagamore Hill was the meal he loved most. The whole family gathered, the children telling the stories of their day, Edith presiding with her particular combination of warmth and sharp attention, and Roosevelt at the head of the table doing what he did all his life, listening and responding and asking questions and being entirely, happily, noisily present. He was a particular lover of game meat, not simply as a trophy hunter's preference, but as someone who had eaten it in the field, cooked over open fires in the Dakota Hills, and associated its specific flavors with specific places and specific states of mind. Bear meat from a Montana hunt, elk from Wyoming, venison from the Adirondacks. He could taste the landscape in it, or imagined he could, which amounted to the same thing. The conservation legacy of Roosevelt's presidency, 150 million acres of national forests, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird reservations, 4 national game preserves, is so large that it is difficult to experience as a series of individual decisions rather than a single overwhelming fact. But each one of those protected places came from a specific moment of will, a specific decision to use the power of the executive office on behalf of the land itself, which had no vote and no lobby and no way to advocate for its own preservation except through the people who loved it enough to act. Roosevelt had been to these places. This was the essential thing. He had stood in the Yosemite Valley and camped under its stars with John Muir, the 2 men lying in their sleeping bags on the valley floor while the snow fell silently, and Muir explained the glacier geology that had shaped every surface around them. And Roosevelt had listened with the total attention he brought to everything that interested him, which was most things. He had ridden through the Badlands in the blue hours before dawn. He had watched the geysers of Yellowstone with the same concentrated wonder he brought to bird watching. These were not abstractions to him. They were places where he had been present and alive in ways that the city and the office and the machinery of public life could not replicate. He said once, speaking about the Grand Canyon, that he hoped Americans would leave it as it was and that they would not try to improve it. The remark was so simple that it was easy to underestimate it, but it contained his entire philosophy of conservation. Not the land as a resource to be managed, not even the land as a heritage to be passed on, but the land as something with its own inherent value that human cleverness was not entitled to improve. He had learned this in the Badlands, carrying his grief through the big, empty silences, until the landscape taught him something about scale and permanence, and the smallness of human suffering against the enduring fact of the earth itself. Roosevelt wrote approximately 150,000 letters in his lifetime. This is not a typo. 150,000. It works out to roughly 4 letters every single day from the time he was a teenager until the week before he died. Written between everything else, the boxing and the reading and the scrambles and the bird lists and the books and the presidency and the grief and the joy and the extraordinary, relentless, full-bore forward motion that was his life in all its dimensions. The letters are where the private Roosevelt lives most fully. In the official speeches and the published books he is performing, however sincerely, constructing an argument, making a case, doing the work of public life with skill and conviction. In the letters, he is simply himself, and himself turns out to be funnier than the statue suggests, more self-deprecating, more vulnerable, more interested in the feelings of the people he is writing to. He wrote to children who sent him fan mail and answered their questions with genuine care. He wrote to scientists about bird behavior and to historians about the accuracy of their sources and to cowboys about the best way to handle a particular kind of horse. He wrote to his children about squirrels and to his wife about how much he missed her and to his old friends about books they had both read and what they thought. His letters to Edith during their long separations read like the correspondence of a man for whom home was not a place but a person. He wrote to her about everything he was seeing and experiencing, not just the significant things but the small ones. What the dawn looked like over the Nile, what a particular bird had done that morning, what he had been reading the night before, what he had eaten for breakfast, and whether it had been any good. He was always pointing things out to her, always wanting her to see what he was seeing, because seeing things without her felt like half-seeing. There are letters in the collection that show a Roosevelt very different from the public one, a man who doubted himself, who worried that he had made the wrong political choices, who felt the loneliness of public life, with a keenness that the extrovert mask almost entirely concealed. There are letters where he writes about missing the Badlands with an intensity that is almost homesickness for a self he had to leave behind when he went back into public life. There are letters where the grief for Alice surfaces decades after her death, quietly, in the middle of a paragraph about something else entirely. A kind of grief that never fully healed but learned to coexist with everything else, the way an old injury becomes part of the body rather than an interruption of it. The 150 million acres that Roosevelt protected are still there, most of them. The national parks and forests and wildlife refuges spread across the American West and Alaska and Florida and beyond, carrying the specific imprint of a man who had stood in those places and known them not as policy abstractions, but as living landscapes with their own beauty and their own requirements. When you stand in the Grand Canyon at sunset, or in Yosemite in the blue hour before dawn, or in a pelican refuge where herons and egrets wade in the shallows, you are standing in a place that exists in its present form because of decisions made by a man who had learned in the Badlands that wild land does something to broken people that nothing else can do, and who had the power for 7 years to act on what he knew. The books are still there too, 35 of them, still in print in various editions, still read by people who approach them first as historical curiosities and find, somewhere in the middle of the naval history, or the bird essays, or the autobiography, a voice so specific and alive that it is difficult to remember that the man behind it has been dead for more than 100 years. The voice in the books is the voice in the letters, which is the voice his children described in their memoirs. Direct, enthusiastic, specific, surprisingly funny, and always in motion, always leaning toward the next thing, the next question, the next bird call from outside the window that needs to be identified before anything else can continue. And then there is the more intimate legacy, the particular way he modeled what it means to be a whole person, one who takes the life of the mind seriously, and the life of the body seriously, and the life of feeling seriously, and the life of the world outside the window seriously, and who refuses to rank these things in a hierarchy where one of them wins and the rest becomes subsidiary. He was a politician and a naturalist and a writer and a father and a grieving husband and a boxer and a bird watcher and a letter writer and a conservationist. And he was all of these things simultaneously rather than in sequence, because he had decided early, in the gym with the dumbbells, in the years when his body was trying to stop him, that the full life was the only life worth having, and that the full life required you to show up for all of it, completely, every day, without reservation. Somewhere in the library at Sagamore Hill, which still stands on its bluff above Oyster Bay, a National Historic Site now, preserved in something close to the state he left it, his books are still shelved in the order he put them in. The worn leather chairs are still there, the animal heads and the bird nests and the children's drawings and the accumulated souvenirs of 60 years of living at maximum engagement are still there. And if you stand in that library on a spring morning with the window open, you can hear the birds from the Sagamore Hill grounds, the same species he listened for, the same songs he could identify by sound alone in the dark, still singing in the trees above the bay. The man is gone. The birds are still there. The morning is still there. And for a moment, paying attention in the way he spent a lifetime insisting was worth the effort, you can feel very clearly what he was trying to do with the time he had. When Theodore Roosevelt died in the dark hours of that January morning in 1919, his vice president, Thomas Marshall, said something that has stayed in the record because it is simply and exactly true. He said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." It is the right epitaph for the public man. But for the private one, for the man with the bird lists and the leather chair and the 150,000 letters and the grief carried across decades and the wood thrush heard through an open window on a summer morning at Sagamore Hill, a different image feels truer. A man who listened so carefully to the world that even at the end, in the dark, the last thing he experienced was the silence just before the birds begin. Thank you for listening. Good night, and sleep well.